between 85 and 90% of all the goods that we trade in the world are transported by sea. So without shipping, there would be no trade. And that is something that has been going for a very long time. The shipping industry is very important when it comes to trade. And that's why shipping industry needs to adapt as well to the new circumstances.
Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where I meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Gothberg. Welcome to episode 181 of the Shipping Podcast. Whoever you are, wherever you are, thank you for tuning in. This is where we talk about the coolest industry on the planet and help raise the maritime industry's profile. Today's episode is all about trade. Why, you ask? Well, without transportation, trade is impossible. And maritime transport is the backbone of international trade. In short, there is more ocean than land surface on planet Earth. Cecilia Malmstrom is a former EU Commissioner for Trade, and what she doesn't know about global trade and trade agreements is not worth knowing. She served as European Commissioner for Trade from 2014 to 2019. So, Cecilia headed the EU trade negotiations with the US, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, which is worth a separate episode, I think. Do I need to say how proud I am to present to you Cecilia Malmstrom, a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. I hope you will enjoy our conversation. Welcome to the Shipping Podcast. Could you please introduce yourself?
Well, hello. It's an honor to be here. I'm Cecilia Malmstrom. I'm a former EU Commissioner responsible for trade and former a lot of other things. And I'm also a senior fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics. It's a think tank in Washington. But I'm a non-resident, so I'm based in Sweden.
And what is your background? What is your education?
I'm a political scientist from Gothenburg University in Sweden. I have a PhD in political science, focusing on European politics, regionalism, and so on. So I did a lot of theoretical European politics for a while, and then I went into European politics for real. I've been in the European Parliament, I was EU minister in the Swedish government, and I've also been twice commissioner, first for Home Affairs, and then 5 years as a trade commissioner.
I'm so honored that you wanted to become a guest on the podcast, so I'm so happy.
Well, the honor is totally mine. Your podcast is world famous.
Can I ask you, when did you come in contact with shipping and the maritime industry?
Well, I'm born in Gothenburg, and so you grow up by the sea and close to the port, and you see all these ships coming and going, and you see them being loaded and the containers. So it's always been kind of part of your life. And I feel very comfortable by the sea. I miss the sea when I'm in cities where you're very far away from it. But then, of course, as a politician engaged in Swedish politics, in European politics, you come across it all the time. So it becomes natural. So by no way I'm an expert in this, but of course, as it's such an important part of my city's history. I mean, we had the East Indian Company 300 years ago. The Gothenburg Harbor has been the center for a very long time for exchanges from all over the world. And of course, you come to realize how important the shipping industry is, not only for this part of Sweden, but also for the rest of the world. So I think it became gradually. And then, of course, I've been to the shipping days in Donsö, which are much more famous than I realized. When you travel abroad and you talk about Gothenburg, sometimes people, well, that's close to Donsö, isn't it? If you are in that shipping industry. So only when I met maritime engaged people across the world did I really fully realize how important Donsö is in this world. And that made me very proud, of course, but also a bit feeling a bit awkward that I hadn't formally realized what an important hub that was. And then, you grow up by the sea, you go swimming, you go sailing, it's part of your life. So of course, when I was in the European Parliament, whenever there's the legislation that touches on piloting or on dredging or ice breaking or things like that, you feel like I need to look at this a bit closer.
And also your area of expertise is trade. So that is global trade. And without global trade, there is no shipping or maritime, I think. And there's so much we can talk about. Can you just give us a short crash course in trade? How does it work and why do we have trade and all of that? I want you to explain that to our listeners.
Well, I think people have been trading and exchanging goods with each other as long as we've been walking on Earth. So it's perfectly natural. As soon as you realize that there's someone else in the village or in the community close to you, they have maybe something that you want. So you exchange food for ceramics, or you exchange bread for textiles. And then, people have started traveling a long way, exchanging goods, mainly with each other, because other goods, either if it's food, it grows more naturally in some places, fruit and vegetables that are maybe more suitable for the southern climate, and other things for a northern climate, and exchange and payment. And this has been going on forever. Now, of course, trade is very much focused on services as well. And they travel, in microseconds all over. But services and goods are also related, because goods need services to be maintained, to be put together. They need to function. They are often very high technological systems involved, and someone needs to fix them when they're broken. So it's very interlinked. And between 85 and 90% of all the goods that we trade in the world are transported by sea. So without shipping, there would be no trade. And that is something that has been going for a very long time. The shipping industry is very important when it comes to trade. And that's why shipping industry needs to adapt as well to the new circumstances. And then trade, in modern times, we try to regulate how trade is done, so that there are certain rules, so that there is a sort of conflict resolution mechanism if there are disputes, and so that you can liberalize trade so that more and more countries can get the benefits of trade. So after the Second World War, when lots of international institutions were created in Bretton Woods, such as IMF and the World Bank, there was also something called GATT that was created. And GATT is the predecessor to what we have today, WTO, the World Trade Organization, where 164 countries are members. And they set rules to try to liberalize rules, to try to make sure that also the developing countries can come into the global trading scene, sometimes with special conditions to sort of phase them in. And that is very important, because without WTO, it would be the total rule of the jungle. The problem today that we have is that WTO is very weak. It has not reformed to the pace that trade has developed. Member states have not engaged as they should, and the rule book is a bit outdated. So that is a big threat to modern trade, that the big international organization that we have is weak and not able to do that. So we need to reform it, we need to fix it. And in the meantime, the last 10, 15 years, countries have started to make agreements with each other outside WTO, respecting the fundamental rules of WTO, but going further. For instance, in the EU is, when it comes to trade, one bloc. EU does trade agreements as a bloc, negotiated by the Commission. We have lots of trade agreements with the world, but also other countries try to negotiate either bilaterally or regionally trade agreements in order to facilitate trade, to make sure that it benefits both partners, to agree on common standards. That sounds very boring, but it's extremely important that we can agree on each other's standards. And trade has also become more and more sustainable in a way that trade today also needs to take its responsibility to make sure that it promotes the United Nations goals of sustainable development and respect for international conventions such as prohibition of child labor and human rights. And so on. So it's a big, very complex world, but it is of course key because trade brings millions and millions and millions of jobs, both exporting and importing. And you and I both come from Sweden. Sweden is totally dependent on trade, but it also brings investment, it brings growth, and it brings people together. Just from the very beginning, when people started to trade with the village on the other side of the hill, you meet people, you learn things, you get to know each other's culture, you sort of get inspired from each other. So it's also a way to bring people together. So trade has a lot of benefits, but of course you need certain rules. And when there are no rules, or when presidents such as, let's say, President Trump says that trade can only be good if it's good for me and bad for you, and that trade wars are good, then the world is getting a dangerous place.
I get so happy when I hear you get so excited about trade, because that is the way I feel about shipping and maritime. We meet a lot of people through our work when we are working in the maritime industry. There's so many things you get to learn and so many different cultures that you get to know. Do you see any trends? Do you see the big global trends also within trade? I mean, there are things happening that is influencing us as an industry, and of course there must be also in the industry of trade. I'm thinking about digitalization and all of that.
Absolutely. I mean, as shipping is such an important part of trade, shipping has been both at the forefront of trying to find new smart solutions, but is also suffering very much when it's not working. And we have become very dependent on shipping and on a few big hubs in the world. And when we trade more than ever with each other during the pandemic, for instance, I mean, digital trade has boomed all over the world. We've ordered lots of things online, and that puts a lot of pressure on transporting and on packaging, both from the factory, you need workers at the factory, you need a lorry to transport the things to the harbor, and then you need the loaders and the people in the harbor. You need seamen who might have been affected and who don't get access to vaccine. And you need the whole sort of link globally for it to function. And we saw last summer when there was this blockade in Ever Given, the big ship in the Suez Channel, how dependent the world became. I mean, this is one very important transportation channel. We had 420 ships blocked, I think, for more than a week. 10% of global shipping goes through the Suez Channel. So, of course, there were lots of things, everything from bicycles and technical components to animals who starved to death that were blocked in this important channel. And that affected industry from all over the world. Suddenly, we couldn't buy bikes in Sweden because they were stuck in the Suez Channel, or there were components and shoes that were going to the Netherlands, to France, to Slovenia, that couldn't get their supply. So this affects the whole world when it's not functioning. And one other trend, if I may, continues, but of course the biggest challenge to humanity is the climate challenge. We need to make sure that we move towards a climate neutral society. And as shipping is such an important part of transporting goods in the world, shipping needs to take a much bigger responsibility. Shipping needs to be cleaner. It needs to be more efficient. It needs to make sure that it can pay its part of, for instance, the emission trading system. Shipping has been excluded for that for a long time now. There are proposals that they will be included as well. And I know that there are lots of research going on how to make the ships a bit smaller but more efficient when it comes to packing them, and also how you can have a more climate neutral fuel in the tanks. Maersk is doing quite a lot on this. So shipping is definitely taking a part of this. And during the pandemic, when a lot of things didn't work because people were sick, so of course that affected the whole world. And we have what we call a supply chain problem today, because hundreds and hundreds, I don't know the last figures, but we talk about 400 or 500 big ships around the world do not have a berth in the big ships in Asia and Los Angeles, around there, because there's a lack of loading people, there's local transport, there's infrastructural problems. Of course, things get stuck. for weeks in this, or months sometimes in these ships. And that affects the prices, that affects inflation, that affects customers, that affects the flowing of the chains, and that affects the whole world. And that will not disappear just because restrictions are lifted in some countries. It will take at least a year for that to start functioning again.
And then again, we are in the headlines because of something bad. I mean, that is my problem. I have a soapbox. We are only known for the things that when it goes bad. For instance, Ever Given, you said that, and the pandemic, and then there might be an oil spill or something, a ship going down or something like that. But we are doing so many good things, and no one knows about all the good things that we are doing.
Sure. I understand that feeling, but I think the Ever Given was actually an eye-opener to a lot of people. I mean, I know people who really were stuck, in front of the news looking at this for the whole week. How is it going to end? Because it opened up eyes for people to understand how transport is really functioning, how trade is working in practice, and how vulnerable we are. And of course, there were mistakes made because the boat was too big to pass. But all these brave people and dredgers and these small machines in Egypt, obviously, but also people came from all over the world to try to rescue this. And the poor seamen who were on the ships waiting. So I think it gave attention and understanding as well, and not only bad things. It was quite educational in a way.
Good. It's so hard to see this from the outside because we always feel like...
I really understand what you mean. And of course, when there are terrible oil spills and so on, we get to blame. But I think it made people more aware of what's happening and how dependent we are and how important shipping is, that it functions, and that the whole supply chain really needs to work from the factory.
Still, the seafarers are not looked upon as key workers, and that is something we're still struggling with.
Yeah, that's a problem. And I know that during the pandemic, there were hundreds and thousands of people stuck in boats all over the world, and they could not get vaccinated because they were not allowed to enter, and they were parted from their families for a very, very long time, and they were not considered as essential workers. And that's a scandal, of course. That so much suffering.
And also the ones at home were not able to travel to the ship, so they didn't have any income. So there's so many things that people do not really know. I think the people in the hospitals are the unsung heroes of the pandemic, but then it's the seafarers. And they haven't got enough credit, I think, for all the work they did and all the sacrifices they did for us to be able to still have our toilet paper in the shops and all of that was discussed.
Absolutely. And I think it's strange that, journalists during these 2 years have been struggling to find new angles of the pandemic. But this has gone a little bit under the radar, and we talk about hundreds and thousands of people. So you're absolutely right. I try to bring it up whenever I can to put light on these brave people who have sacrificed so much. But you're right, and it's a bit odd that has not been into the news headlines to a larger extent.
How do you see the future then for shipping, trade, and all of that? What's on the horizon for us?
Well, there are lots of challenges, of course, particularly when it comes to shipping. We need to fix those supply chain problems, and that some of it will disappear if the pandemic disappears, but some of it is also long-term negligence of upgrading the infrastructures of big ports. So that needs to be done. Probably we need more hubs to spread it. We need smaller, quicker vessels in order to respond to the demand. Shipping also has to take its share of the climate goals and to be greener in a way. And I know there's a lot of things going on there, and lots of research and a lot of different new inventions that we read about.
In a way, we are also looking for the same answer to that as everyone else. What is the future energy? What is that going to be? Yeah. And it's also got an impact on the shipping industry in that way that we are transporting so much of energy around the world in ships.
Indeed. And the energy issue is very complicated right now as we talk, of course. And then we have, there are changes in the world on a bigger scale, we have, of course, the digitalization, which will mean that, and some of the big ports in the world have already, adjusted to this, that you don't see many real people working. A lot has been digitalized, and there's a lot of new technologies coming up so that you can follow from the factory through the transport until the delivery at the other end of the world to the individual customer. And that is, of course, excellent, so that you can trace it, you can follow it, and that you can, in this case, be more efficient. We have trends in the world right now that trade is becoming more protectionist after the pandemic, both in the US and in Europe, focusing on some things that make sense to produce some key material closer to home, both when it comes to medical equipment, but also some things that we really need, such as batteries and semiconductors, where there is a big demand right now. But that should not lead to us disconnecting from the world, because building up this capacity takes time, and some rare materials you need, and they do not exist in many countries in the world. So we do need to trade and to engage with others as well. And when you talk about strategic autonomy, as the EU very often does right now, you have to remember that if you become more autonomous from the world also becomes more autonomous from you. And engaging and trading with the world has been one of the EU's key assets. It has been very good for the economy and for the citizens and for the welfare states, but it's also been a way to connect with people, with building alliances on a broader scale. So that scares me a little bit, that we must have fair trade. It is perfectly natural to try to produce some things closer to home, but not disconnecting, and not by making this in a protectionist way.
Yeah, but we also see growth in the world, and that is probably in the Far East and Africa. So then they are going to also start producing what we have been producing. And maybe that will also be a bit protective. I don't know.
Yes, but also, the whole idea of trade is that you produce what you're best at, and then you sell that and you exchange it for something else that you can't produce because of weather, or because of other climate issues, or because of that you don't have the technology. So, of course, we need to support each other in that. And trade has been a formidable force of fighting poverty. Millions and millions and millions of people have been lifted out of poverty when they engage in global trade. So we should not forget that part either. And make sure also that the WTO organization is updated so that we have common rules on digital trade, for instance, and also that the dispute settlement mechanism, which is not functional today, works, so that you can bring things to WTO when there is a conflict, and we rewrite or upgrade the rules for what was asked today. And then we see another very worrying trend, and has not so much to do with the shipping sector, but it's of course affecting that trade becomes very geopolitical. That when you disagree on foreign policy issues, you use sanctions as well. We see that now in the discussion with Russia and the threat of invading Ukraine. There are sanctions. Economic sanctions, trade sanctions are there. We have seen it between US and China. We see that China very often uses sanction against countries or companies who criticize them on violation of human rights. We see it right now with poor little Lithuania. But we also saw some big clothing companies who have been criticizing the conditions in the Xinjiang province, for instance, that they have been punished from China in that regard. So trade is also becoming a weapon in a way. We've seen it before, but right now it's accumulating.
So what is the way forward to update WTO? I got that from the beginning.
Yeah, well, that's not easy, because the WTO has been in crisis for many years, and it's a United Nations organization, so you work with unanimity. So it's hard to agree on 164 countries. Every second year, there is a ministerial meeting where ministers from all the member countries meet. That has been postponed now for several years. It was supposed to take place 1.5 years ago, and then now again in November, and now maybe it will take place later this spring. And of course, people need to meet. You cannot negotiate these things over Zoom. So you need to meet, you need to make sure that the big countries, US, China, India, EU, take the responsibility and dedicate themselves to try to find compromise. And there's no quick fix. You will not fix WTO over 5 days. You will gradually need to update the rules and agree on a few things. And if not all countries can agree, then you can move with those who want to agree. For instance, there are almost 100 countries who are negotiating right now a global agreement on e-commerce, on digital trade, where we would try to find common rules on a digital contract, for instance, or e-signatures, which can be very useful for small companies living in not urban areas, and certain common rules on this. And if not all countries want to agree, those who want to can make that deal, and then others can join when they feel ready. So I think that is a way also to move forward with those who want to, because if you at this point you can't really wait for everybody. But you also need to make sure that WTO rules are respected, because if not, then it really becomes the rule of the jungle, and those who lose are small countries and developing countries. And for instance, the trade war between the US and China is not according to WTO rules. And the US imposed tariffs on steel and aluminium during the Trump era towards a lot of countries, and motivating that for internal security reasons, which is, of course, totally awkward. And that is definitely against WTO rules. So, if big countries do not respect common rules, why should the small ones do it?
How does it feel to become, when you enter those places, when you did that, did you feel like you were respected? For the office you had at that time, or was it hard to know how to sort of meet these people?
Well, when it comes to trade, the EU Commission has a lot of power, because according to the EU treaties, the rulings that we have, member states have agreed that the Commission has exclusive powers in trade, meaning that it is the EU, the Commissioner for Trade and the team, who negotiate trade agreements on behalf of all the member states. And that makes sense, of course, because we have an internal market, the biggest, most advanced internal market in the world. Now, after the Brits left, 455 million people, customers, potential, with common rules. And that is a very attractive asset. And of course, it makes much more sense if you have that in your negotiating bag than if, Sweden, Slovenia, Denmark, or even France and Germany negotiate on their own with Japan or with Australia or with the US or China. And also it is the Commission who speaks on behalf of all the member states in the WTO. So that gives the Commission a lot of power. And that, of course, is something that other countries know, that when you come and you say, I come from the EU, you have 27 countries behind you, and that gives you a lot of clout. That doesn't mean that we can do whatever we want. Of course, you need to have a very, very intense cooperation with all the member states all the time, and the European Parliament, because they have to eventually say yes or no to a trade agreement. So you need to engage all the time with ministers, with members of parliament, to make sure that they know what you're doing, to discuss what are our next negotiating move, where are red lines, and so on. And you need to listen to all other stakeholders. So I tried very much to make trade as transparent and inclusive as possible, meaning that you need to listen to, for instance, the shipping industry, because you have a lot of knowledge and a lot of opinions, but you also need to listen to small companies, to the environmental organization, to consumer organization, trade unions, other business organizations, in order to try to explain what you're doing and get their inputs and ideas so that it becomes more inclusive. But having that makes, of course, not you as individual, but what you symbolize, that you have a lot of power when you negotiate with others. And then it's not like you sit alone with the minister from Japan. We both have huge teams who prepare and who negotiate, and making a trade agreement takes several years. And lots of it is technical issues that takes time, but it's not very controversial. So the political level comes in when there's a blockade, or when you need to define and give sort of instructions to your team, or when you need to try to find compromises to unlock, a blocking of something when you disagree. And the trade agreement is we say that we try to facilitate trade and make it easier. And that's true. But the trade agreement between EU and Canada, for instance, it is 1,500 pages. of agreement. So there's a lot of rules regulating what you deregulate and what you liberalize.
And it's in French, or?
It exists in all EU official languages, all 23. And it's online, so you can read it. If you have problems sleeping a Friday evening, you can start reading it in Swedish or in Danish or in Portuguese.
Did you have a role model growing up?
I've had lots of role models. I've been surrounded by very strong women in my family, my mother and my grandmother, and I have lots of very strong, charismatic aunts. So, of course, that. And then also I've been in politics for many years. So there also I could find some people who, both men and women actually, often were a bit older, but who sort of tried to help and mentor and support. And also in the university, I had a few professors that I really looked up to and that I learned a lot from. It's important to have people that you can turn to and ask for help and listen to their advice. And now I try in my turn to sort of try to mentor and coach younger women, especially, and to encourage them to shine and to be what they can be.
I think we have a responsibility there when we have a little bit of experience. That is what we call the gray hair.
Yes, you need to give back. Absolutely.
Yes.
And you and I you're in the shipping business. I am in the trade business, and it is still quite male dominated. But there are so many hyper qualified women all over there on all levels. Maybe not always on the very highest, but just beyond. And you need to push them. You need to give them visibility, and you need to make sure that they also can fill the room, because they are often the people who really do the work.
I know, been there, done that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so who would you be interested in listening to in the shipping podcast? Who do you think I should interview the next?
Oh, wow. You've made so many programs, so you probably covered everybody responsible, no? Maybe you could ask, but he would, my successor, the commissioner who took over from me, Mr. Valdis Dombrovskis, who is vice president of the commission and responsible for trade. He is from Latvia, a very kind and nice man. And of course, he took over in a different time. I mean, I was lucky. We had a period when we did a lot of trade agreements. Countries were lining up to do trade agreements with Europe, and we engaged and we concluded a lot of them. Now it's more difficult because of the pandemic and because of the WTO crisis and because of more protectionism surmounting. So of course he has a difficult role. I think he's doing very well, but maybe you can try to interview him. He has a different perspective, and he will be even more up to date than I am, because of course I left 2 years ago.
I will be happy to. I will see if I can, if he would agree to do that. And we also need to plug your series. You have an online series where people can listen to more if they get interested in trade today. Where can they find that?
Yes, I run a monthly digital seminar called Trade Wins, which is 1 hour discussion on different trade-related topics on behalf of Peterson, PIIE. So you can find former episodes online. And then you can also sign up to listen to them live, but they stay on the website for several months. And we have been discussing the recovery. We've been discussing the outcome of the Glasgow meeting and its impact on trade. We have been discussing African trade with the new African customs union, where the whole of Africa is trying to make Africa into an intercontinental trade area. It's a very exciting project. We've been discussing shipping, actually. There was a researcher from the US and the director, one of the directors at Maersk. And that was we will discuss digital trade. We will be discussing the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU is pushing through, and that will have a lot of effect on trade. However, it ends, because this is a hard negotiation. And, lots of very interesting trade-related areas. And you just sign up and you can listen, or you can go into Old.
I will make sure to include a link in the show notes so they can find you.
That's kind of you.
However, I think I need to stop you now because I will be losing my audience. They will find this more interesting to listen to you than probably to my podcast. Or maybe they can do both.
Not at all. They can do both, yes. And yours is more often.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me. This was a real pleasure for me.
Thank you, Lena. It was very nice talking to you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Cecilia. You have been one of my role models for a very long time. And I'm so grateful that you agreed to be my guest on the Shipping Podcast. I'm also pleased to hear that maybe after the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal, people outside the maritime industry stopped to think about international trade and the role that the maritime industry plays. Perhaps that tragic event can lead to something good after all. Dear listener, go spread the word about this episode. That is your task. And if you have ideas of who you want to listen to here, please drop me a line at hello@shippingpodcast.com. I have a few great people more in the pipeline, but I'm always open to suggestions. Until the next time, from me to you, over and out. Thank you for listening to the Shipping Podcast. Don't forget to tell everyone that you meet that there is a shipping podcast available and that they should download it and listen to the maritime professionals who are sharing their passion for the shipping industry.